The security guards who worked the contracts coordinated by the dispatch center had varying levels of professionalism and competence, but most were retired police officers or military veterans who treated the job as semi-retirement rather than serious security work. They would call in with reports that lacked basic details, request schedule changes for personal convenience, and sometimes ignore instructions when they disagreed with dispatch decisions. Sarah's attempts to maintain professional standards were met with resistance from guards who viewed her as an inexperienced college graduate who didn't understand real-world security challenges. The clients served by Phoenix Security Solutions represented a cross-section of Arizona's commercial and residential real estate market, from upscale shopping centers in Scottsdale to apartment complexes in less affluent neighborhoods. Each property had unique security requirements and challenges, but most clients viewed security as a necessary expense rather than a strategic investment, leading to constant pressure to reduce costs and minimize guard presence. Sarah's daily routine began at 6 in the morning with a review of overnight incident reports and guard status updates. The night shift dispatcher would brief her on any significant events, equipment problems, or personnel issues that required follow-up during day shift operations. Most mornings brought the usual collection of minor incidents: false alarms at retail stores, vehicle break-ins in parking lots, and complaints about noise or suspicious activity that required guard response. The radio traffic that filled the dispatch center throughout the day provided a constant soundtrack of routine security operations. Guards would check in at the beginning of their shifts, report their arrival at assigned posts, and provide periodic updates on patrol activities. Emergency calls were rare and usually involved situations that required police or medical response rather than security intervention. But Sarah remained constantly alert for the kind of crisis that would demand immediate coordination of multiple resources. Her lunch breaks were spent alone in her car, parked in the employee lot behind the dispatch center, eating sandwiches while listening to news radio or reading technical magazines. She avoided the break room where other employees gathered to discuss television shows, weekend plans, and office politics that held no interest for her. The isolation was self-imposed but necessary, a way of maintaining the emotional distance that protected her from forming relationships that might lead to uncomfortable questions about her background. The afternoon shift brought increased activity as schools dismissed and businesses closed, creating higher call volumes and more complex coordination requirements. Shopping center clients would request additional patrols during peak hours, office buildings would need escorts for employees working late, and residential complexes would report the kind of minor disturbances that required diplomatic rather than enforcement responses. Sarah's handling of these routine situations was competent, but unremarkable, exactly as she intended. She followed established procedures, maintained professional communication with guards and clients, and resolved problems through standard protocols that had been developed over years of security operations. Her supervisors had no reason to suspect that she was capable of anything beyond the basic requirements of her position. The evening hours were typically the busiest time for security operations, as businesses closed and nighttime activities created increased opportunities for criminal activity. Sarah would coordinate patrol schedules to provide adequate coverage for high-risk properties while managing guard assignments to ensure that experienced officers were positioned at locations most likely to require intervention. Webb's end-of-shift reviews had become a daily ritual of finding fault with her performance, often focusing on minor procedural issues or suggesting improvements to her communication style. His feedback was delivered with the kind of patronizing tone that implied Sarah should be grateful for his guidance and patient with his efforts to develop her professional skills. She would listen politely, acknowledge his suggestions, and implement only those changes that actually improved operations while ignoring the rest. The drive home through Phoenix traffic provided time for Sarah to decompress from the emotional strain of maintaining her civilian persona while suppressing the tactical instincts that remained her default response to challenging situations. She would listen to classical music or news programs, avoiding the country music and rock stations that reminded her of the music that had played in ready rooms and mess halls during her military service. Her evening routine was deliberately structured to maintain the kind of personal discipline that had been essential during military service, while adapting to the reduced physical and mental demands of civilian employment. She would exercise in the apartment complex fitness center, prepare simple meals that met her nutritional requirements without requiring elaborate cooking, and spend time reading or taking online courses that kept her mind engaged without triggering memories of her military experience. The loneliness of her civilian life was a constant presence that Sarah had learned to manage rather than eliminate. She missed the camaraderie of military service, the shared understanding that came from facing dangerous situations with people who understood the stakes and consequences of their actions. The superficial relationships available in civilian employment couldn't replace the bonds forged in combat, leaving her emotionally isolated despite being surrounded by colleagues and clients throughout each workday. But Sarah had chosen this life deliberately, trading the excitement and purpose of military aviation for the safety and anonymity of civilian employment. She was exactly where she wanted to be, hidden in plain sight among people who would never suspect that the quiet dispatcher in the corner cubicle had once controlled the most sophisticated attack helicopter in the world's most powerful military. In a few hours, everything would change, and the carefully constructed world of routine security operations would be shattered by the kind of crisis that demanded split-second decisions and lethal precision. Regional Manager David Blackstone commanded Phoenix Security Solutions with the aggressive confidence of someone who had built a successful business through relentless self-promotion and careful cultivation of client relationships. At 55, his silver hair was styled to project authority, his expensive suits were tailored to disguise a growing paunch, and his office occupied the entire corner of the building's top floor, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling Phoenix metropolitan area. Blackstone's rise to regional management had been built on his ability to present himself as the embodiment of private security professionalism, despite having no actual experience in law enforcement or military service. His background was entirely civilian, starting with a college degree in business administration, followed by a series of sales positions that had taught him the art of convincing clients that his company could solve their security problems better than any competitor. The walls of his office displayed certificates from security industry associations, photographs with local politicians and business leaders, and awards recognizing his company's growth and client satisfaction ratings. Missing from this impressive collection were any credentials that would indicate personal experience with actual security operations, tactical planning, or crisis management. Blackstone's expertise was entirely theoretical, based on industry publications, conference seminars, and consultations with subcontractors who possessed the practical knowledge he lacked. His daily routine began with a review of financial reports and client account status, focusing on revenue streams and profit margins rather than operational effectiveness or personnel welfare. Blackstone viewed security as a business commodity rather than a professional service, measuring success through quarterly earnings and contract renewals rather than prevented incidents or successful emergency responses. The regional manager's philosophy of leadership was built on the belief that business success depended on maintaining clear hierarchies and controlling costs through efficient personnel management. He viewed employees as interchangeable resources whose primary value lay in their ability to perform assigned tasks without requiring expensive training or specialized expertise. His management style emphasized compliance with company policies and client expectations while discouraging initiative or independent thinking that might complicate established procedures. Blackstone's attitude toward his dispatch staff reflected his broader assumptions about gender and age in the security industry. He believed that young women were suitable for administrative roles because they possessed natural communication skills and attention to detail, but he considered them fundamentally unsuited for positions requiring tactical judgment or crisis management. In his mind, dispatch work was essentially secretarial, involving the coordination of resources according to predetermined procedures rather than dynamic decision-making under pressure. B.C. Sarah Chen had first attracted Blackstone's attention during a client meeting, where her supervisor had mentioned her efficiency in handling complex scheduling problems and her ability to maintain professional communication with difficult clients. While Webb had intended these comments as praise, Blackstone had interpreted them as evidence that Sarah was exceeding the appropriate boundaries of her position, involving herself in matters that should be handled by senior personnel with greater experience and authority. The regional manager's interactions with Sarah were carefully calculated to reinforce his expectations about her role while demonstrating his authority over all aspects of company operations. He would visit the dispatch center during busy periods, observing her work while making pointed comments about the importance of following established procedures and avoiding the temptation to make decisions that were beyond her level of responsibility. Blackstone's concerns about Sarah intensified when he began receiving feedback from clients about her performance that seemed inconsistent with his assumptions about her capabilities. Property managers would mention her ability to coordinate complex security responses during emergencies. Corporate clients would praise her tactical recommendations for improving guard deployment, and even some of the more experienced security guards would comment on her understanding of operational procedures that typically required years of field experience to develop. Rather than recognizing these reports as evidence of exceptional competence, Blackstone interpreted them as signs that Sarah was overstepping her authority and potentially creating liability issues for the company. He believed that clients were being misled about her qualifications, and that her apparent expertise was actually dangerous improvisation that could result in serious problems if she was allowed to continue making decisions beyond her proper scope of responsibility. The regional manager's campaign to limit Sarah's authority began with subtle modifications to dispatch procedures that reduced her decision-making autonomy while increasing supervisory oversight of her activities. New policies required dispatcher approval from senior staff before implementing certain types of guard deployments, restricted access to client contact information, and mandated detailed documentation of all non-routine communications with guards or property managers. These changes were presented as company-wide efficiency improvements designed to standardize operations and reduce the potential for miscommunication between dispatchers and field personnel. But Sarah quickly recognized that the modifications specifically targeted the areas where her experience and judgment had been most valuable, effectively limiting her ability to respond effectively to complex situations that required tactical thinking rather than procedural compliance. Blackstone's supervision of Sarah became increasingly intrusive as he convinced himself that close monitoring was necessary to prevent her from making mistakes that could damage client relationships or expose the company to legal liability. He would review her call logs and incident reports with obsessive attention to detail, questioning her handling of routine situations and suggesting alternative approaches that reflected standard industry practices rather than optimal operational responses. The regional manager's office became a platform for delivering lectures about the importance of understanding one's limitations and working within established organizational hierarchies. He would summon Sarah for meetings that were ostensibly about performance review but actually served as opportunities for him to reinforce his assumptions about appropriate roles for someone with her background and experience level. Blackstone's worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that a young female dispatcher might possess expertise that exceeded his own understanding of security operations, so he constructed alternative explanations that preserved his assumptions about competence and authority. He attributed client praise to Sarah's pleasant telephone manner rather than her tactical recommendations, dismissed guard compliance with her instructions as evidence of their own inexperience rather than recognition of her expertise, and interpreted her efficient handling of complex situations as lucky improvisation rather than skilled crisis management. The psychological profile that Blackstone had constructed for Sarah was based on stereotypes about young women in the workplace rather than observation of her actual capabilities and performance. He viewed her as ambitious but naive, eager to prove herself but lacking the experience necessary for sound judgment under pressure. His management approach was designed to channel what he saw as her enthusiasm into appropriate activities while preventing her from attempting tasks that were beyond her qualifications. The regional manager's staff had learned to navigate his preferences and prejudices through careful observation and tactical communication. They understood that he valued traditional business metrics over operational effectiveness, that he responded favorably to presentations emphasizing cost control and client satisfaction, and that challenging his assumptions about personnel capabilities was career suicide. The culture he had created rewarded compliance and discouraged the kind of independent thinking that might expose the limitations of his own knowledge and experience. Marcus Webb, as dispatch supervisor, had developed a particularly sophisticated understanding of Blackstone's expectations and concerns. Webb served as a filter between the regional manager's directives and the day-to-day realities of dispatch operations, implementing policies that satisfied Blackstone's need for control while maintaining enough operational flexibility to handle the inevitable complications that arose during actual security emergencies. The relationship between Blackstone and his client base was built on his ability to project confidence and competence, while carefully managing their expectations about service capabilities and limitations. He excelled at presenting his company as a professional organization capable of handling any security challenge, But he was careful to avoid commitments that might require resources or expertise that his organization didn't actually possess. Corporate clients appreciated Blackstone's business-focused approach to security services, viewing him as someone who understood their commercial priorities and could provide cost-effective solutions that met their insurance requirements without unnecessary complications. Property management companies valued his emphasis on customer service and professional appearance, recognizing that his guards and dispatchers represented their properties in interactions with tenants and visitors. Retail clients found Blackstone's promises of comprehensive security coverage reassuring, even though the actual service delivery often fell short of the sophisticated capabilities he implied during sales presentations. His success depended on managing client expectations carefully enough that they remained satisfied with basic security services while believing they were receiving premium protection. The regional manager's understanding of security threats and countermeasures was entirely academic, based on industry publications and conference presentations, rather than practical experience with actual criminal activity or emergency response. He could discuss security concepts using appropriate terminology and present implementation plans that sounded comprehensive, but his knowledge lacked the depth that came from personal involvement in high-stakes situations, where theoretical knowledge had to be translated into effective action. Blackstone's attitude toward military veterans in the security industry was complex and somewhat contradictory. He recognized that veteran status was valuable for marketing purposes, appealing to clients who associated military service with competence and professionalism. But he was also uncomfortable with employees whose experience exceeded his own, viewing them as potential challenges to his authority rather than assets that could improve company capabilities. Female employees presented particular challenges for Blackstone's management style because his assumptions about gender roles conflicted with the industry's growing recognition that women could excel in security positions that had traditionally been dominated by men. He had learned to avoid overt discrimination while maintaining practices that effectively limited female employees to administrative roles rather than operational positions. Sarah's quiet competence and professional demeanor fit perfectly with Blackstone's expectations for female employees, confirming his belief that women were naturally suited for supportive roles that required organization and communication skills. Her apparent youth and civilian background suggested that she would be grateful for his guidance and patient with his efforts to develop her professional capabilities within appropriate boundaries. The regional manager had no way of knowing that his assumptions about Sarah's background and qualifications were fundamentally incorrect, that the young woman he saw as a typical entry-level employee was actually someone whose military experience included responsibilities that exceeded anything in his civilian career. Her deliberate anonymity was so complete that he could look directly at her personnel file without recognizing the carefully constructed fiction that concealed her true background and capabilities. Blackstone's daily interactions with the dispatch center followed predictable patterns designed to reinforce his authority, while gathering information about operations that he could use to demonstrate his knowledge during client meetings. He would ask questions about call volumes and response times, review guard deployment schedules, and make suggestions about efficiency improvements that reflected his business background rather than operational expertise. The regional manager's office was equipped with monitoring systems that allowed him to oversee dispatch communications and guard activities, but his understanding of what he observed was limited by his lack of practical experience with security operations. He could identify deviations from established procedures, but couldn't distinguish between dangerous improvisation and skilled adaptation to changing circumstances. Blackstone's success in building Phoenix Security Solutions into a regional powerhouse had been achieved through careful market positioning and aggressive business development rather than superior operational capabilities. His company's reputation was based on professional presentation and reliable service delivery rather than exceptional performance during crisis situations or complex security challenges. The regional manager's vision for company growth emphasized expansion into new markets and service areas, rather than deepening expertise in current operations. He viewed specialization as limiting and preferred to maintain the flexibility that came from offering basic security services to diverse client types, rather than developing advanced capabilities for specific industries or threat environments. His personnel policies reflected this business philosophy, emphasizing cost control and operational standardization over individual employee development or recognition of exceptional capabilities. The company's training programs focused on compliance with established procedures rather than tactical skills or emergency response capabilities, creating a workforce that could handle routine security tasks but might struggle during genuine crises that required creative thinking and decisive action. Sarah's position within this organizational structure was both invisible and potentially explosive, a hidden capability that Blackstone couldn't recognize but would soon need more desperately than he could possibly imagine. His carefully constructed business empire was about to face the kind of crisis that would expose the difference between theoretical knowledge and combat-tested expertise, and the young woman he had systematically underestimated would prove to be his company's most valuable asset in a situation where failure meant not just lost profits, but lost lives. The pattern of professional diminishment began with small changes that most employees wouldn't have noticed, but Sarah's military training had taught her to recognize the subtle indicators of systematic targeting. It started 3 months after Blackstone's first direct interaction with her, when she discovered that her access to certain client databases had been quietly restricted without explanation or notification from her supervisors. The changes were implemented gradually and justified through various administrative explanations that made them difficult to challenge directly. Her security clearance for accessing sensitive client information was downgraded under new company policies that supposedly affected all dispatcher personnel, but Sarah quickly noticed that other dispatchers retained access to systems that were now blocked from her terminal. Webb delivered the news about her reduced responsibilities with the apologetic tone of someone following orders he didn't entirely understand. The company was implementing new security protocols, he explained, that required more senior personnel to handle certain types of client communications and operational decisions. Sarah's role would be refocused on basic dispatch duties, while more complex coordination tasks would be reassigned to employees with greater experience in the security industry. The first major restriction came when Sarah was prohibited from directly contacting property managers or corporate security directors without prior approval from Webb or Blackstone. This policy change was presented as an effort to ensure consistent communication standards and prevent miscommunication between the company and its clients. But the practical effect was to eliminate Sarah's ability to provide tactical recommendations or coordinate complex security responses during emergency situations. Sarah's attempts to discuss these limitations with Webb were met with responses that reflected the regional manager's influence over dispatch operations. Her supervisor had been instructed to monitor her activities more closely and ensure that she understood the appropriate boundaries of her position within the company hierarchy. Webb's explanations emphasized the importance of following established procedures and avoiding the temptation to exceed her authorized responsibilities. The reduction in Sarah's decision-making authority became particularly evident during shift changes and weekend operations, when fewer supervisory personnel were available to provide guidance and oversight. Situations that she had previously handled independently now required approval from senior staff who often lacked the immediate availability or technical knowledge necessary for effective crisis management. Corporate clients began to notice the changes in service quality when their calls were transferred between multiple personnel instead of being handled by the competent dispatcher who had previously managed their accounts. Property managers who had developed working relationships with Sarah found themselves explaining their security requirements to different employees who lacked familiarity with their properties and operational needs. The security guards who worked the company's contracts were also affected by the restrictions on Sarah's authority, particularly during emergency situations that required rapid coordination of multiple resources. Her instructions, which had previously carried the weight of command authority, now had to be confirmed by supervisory personnel, who might not be immediately available or familiar with the tactical situation developing in the field. Sarah's response to these professional limitations was characteristic of the discipline that had once made her an exceptional military aviator. She adapted to her reduced responsibilities without complaint, found ways to work within the new constraints while maintaining operational effectiveness, and continued performing her assigned duties with the same precision that had characterized her combat flying. But the psychological impact of the systematic diminishment was more difficult to manage than the practical challenges of working within restricted parameters. Sarah had spent years in positions where her judgment was trusted implicitly, and her decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The transition to a role where her competence was questioned and her authority was severely limited triggered responses that she had to carefully suppress to maintain her civilian cover. The most frustrating aspect of her situation was the recognition that the limitations being imposed were actually making the dispatch center less effective at handling complex security situations. Her military experience had taught her to identify and address operational vulnerabilities before they became serious problems, but her current role prevented her from implementing the improvements that could enhance the company's service capabilities. Blackstone's campaign of professional restriction extended beyond operational limitations to include subtle forms of social isolation that were designed to reinforce Sarah's subordinate status within the company hierarchy. Her invitations to staff meetings were reduced to those sessions where her administrative input was specifically required, excluding her from strategic planning discussions and client relationship management activities. The regional manager's comments about Sarah during company meetings began to carry increasingly dismissive undertones that were designed to shape how other employees perceived her capabilities and contributions. He would make pointed remarks about the importance of understanding one's limitations and working within established organizational boundaries, often while making eye contact with Sarah to ensure that his message was clearly received. These public demonstrations of authority were carefully calculated to maintain the appearance of professional guidance, while actually serving as humiliation tactics designed to discourage Sarah from challenging the restrictions that had been imposed on her role. Blackstone's approach was sophisticated enough to avoid overt harassment while still creating an environment where Sarah's credibility and professional standing were systematically undermined. The other dispatchers began to notice the changes in Sarah's status within the company, though their responses varied depending on their own relationships with management and their personal opinions about workplace politics. Maria Santos, who had worked for the company longer than anyone else in the dispatch center, expressed private sympathy for Sarah's situation, while being careful not to challenge the decisions that had led to her reduced responsibilities. Some of the newer employees interpreted the restrictions on Sarah's authority as evidence that she had made mistakes or demonstrated poor judgment in ways that justified increased supervision. The company's culture discouraged open discussion of personnel decisions, so speculation about the reasons for Sarah's changed status remained largely unspoken but influenced how colleagues interacted with her on a daily basis. The security guards who had worked with Sarah during her first months with the company were particularly confused by the changes in her authority and communication protocols. Many of them were military veterans themselves who had recognized something familiar in her competence and tactical awareness, and they found it difficult to understand why someone with her obvious capabilities was being treated as though she lacked basic qualifications for dispatcher duties. Several of the more experienced guards attempted to continue following Sarah's instructions during routine operations, but they were quickly informed by supervisory personnel that all coordination decisions now required approval from senior staff. This created confusion in the field and delays in response times that affected the quality of service provided to clients throughout the company's coverage area. Sarah's documentation of the systematic restrictions began during her second week of reduced authority, when she recognized that the changes were part of a coordinated campaign rather than random policy adjustments. Her military training had included instruction in recognizing and responding to hostile intelligence operations, and she applied those same analytical techniques to understand the pattern of limitations being imposed on her civilian employment. The evidence she gathered included email communications, policy memoranda, and incident reports that demonstrated how her access and authority had been systematically reduced without corresponding changes affecting other dispatcher personnel. Her analysis revealed that the restrictions were specifically targeted at the areas where her military experience had been most valuable, effectively neutralizing her ability to contribute expertise that exceeded standard industry practices. Sarah's apartment became a secure facility for storing and analyzing the documentation she was gathering about her treatment at Phoenix Security Solutions. Her approach to intelligence collection was methodical and comprehensive, designed to build an irrefutable case while avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as insubordination or policy violations. The psychological toll of maintaining her civilian persona while enduring systematic professional diminishment was more significant than Sarah had anticipated when she chose anonymity over recognitions. The constant need to suppress her natural responses to inefficiency and poor decision-making required mental energy that left her emotionally exhausted at the end of each workday. The isolation created by her restricted role was compounded by her inability to explain to colleagues why the limitations were unjustified without revealing the military background that she was committed to keeping secret. Her coworkers saw only a young woman who was apparently struggling to meet the requirements of a basic dispatcher position, not a combat veteran whose qualifications exceeded those of anyone else in the company. Client relationships that Sarah had carefully developed during her first months with the company began to deteriorate as property managers and corporate security directors found themselves dealing with different personnel who lacked familiarity with their specific requirements and operational challenges. The continuity of service that had been one of Sarah's greatest contributions to company operations was disrupted by policies that prevented her from maintaining direct communication with the clients she had been serving most effectively. The afternoon shift became particularly challenging for Sarah as the increased activity and complexity of security operations required the kind of dynamic coordination that was now prohibited by her restricted authority. Emergency situations that she could have managed efficiently now required multiple approvals and consultations that delayed response times and complicated communication with field personnel. The evening hours brought the most frustration as Sarah watched from her limited role, while less experienced personnel struggled to handle situations that she could have resolved quickly and effectively. Her military training had emphasized the importance of mission accomplishment above personal considerations, and the forced passivity of her current situation conflicted with every instinct that had been developed through years of combat operations. Webb's implementation of Blackstone's directives became increasingly apologetic as the dispatch supervisor recognized that the restrictions were actually making his department less effective at handling the complex coordination tasks that were essential for quality security services. But his position within the company hierarchy left him no choice but to enforce policies that he privately questioned while trying to maintain operational effectiveness despite the artificial limitations that had been imposed. The security industry's emphasis on liability management and insurance compliance provided Blackstone with ready justifications for the restrictions he had imposed on Sarah's authority. He could present the limitations as prudent risk management measures designed to ensure that only properly qualified personnel made decisions that could affect client safety and company reputation. Corporate clients who noticed changes in service quality were assured that the company was implementing enhanced quality control measures that would ultimately improve the consistency and reliability of security services. The explanations were plausible enough to maintain client confidence while concealing the fact that the changes were actually reducing the company's operational capabilities. Retail property managers who had benefited from Sarah's tactical expertise found themselves dealing with dispatcher personnel who could follow established procedures but lacked the experience necessary to adapt to unusual situations or provide innovative solutions to security challenges. The decline in service quality was gradual enough to avoid immediate client complaints but significant enough to affect the company's competitive position in the regional security market. Sarah's knowledge of the company's operational vulnerabilities was growing daily as she observed the effects of her reduced authority on overall service delivery and emergency response capabilities. Her military experience had taught her to identify systemic weaknesses that could be exploited by hostile forces, and she could see how the restrictions imposed on her role were actually making the entire organization more vulnerable to the kind of crisis that would require exceptional coordination and tactical expertise. The irony of her situation was not lost on Sarah as she watched Blackstone's efforts to limit her authority actually creating the conditions that would eventually force her to reveal the capabilities she had been working so hard to conceal. The systematic restrictions that were intended to keep her in her proper place were systematically dismantling the operational safeguards that protected the company and its clients from threats that exceeded the capabilities of routine security personnel. The regional manager's confidence in his approach was reinforced by the apparent success of his campaign to reduce Sarah's visibility and influence within the organization. Her name had disappeared from client reports and operational summaries. Her input was no longer sought during strategic planning sessions, and her role had been effectively reduced to basic administrative support that required no special expertise or tactical judgment. But what Blackstone couldn't understand was that every restriction he imposed was being cataloged by someone whose military training had taught her to recognize preparation for future operations. Sarah was documenting everything, analyzing patterns, and preparing for the moment when the limitations he had created would collide with a crisis that demanded capabilities he didn't know she possessed. The systematic campaign to diminish her authority was actually preparing the battlefield for a confrontation that would expose the fundamental difference between theoretical knowledge and combat-tested expertise. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came through a routine call that should have been handled by standard emergency procedures, but quickly escalated into something far beyond the capabilities of conventional security response. At 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, the Sunrise Canyon Shopping Center's head of security called the Phoenix Security Solutions Dispatch Center with what initially sounded like a standard incident report. "We've got a situation developing in the north parking structure." The voice of Jim Morrison, a retired Phoenix police detective who managed security for the upscale shopping complex, carried an unusual tension that immediately caught Sarah's attention. Multiple vehicles with unusual occupancy patterns, coordinated movement, and what appears to be surveillance equipment. This doesn't look like normal criminal activity. Sarah's response was automatically professional, following the standard protocols that had been drilled into every dispatcher during company training. She began logging the incident while asking Morrison for additional details about the number of vehicles, their descriptions, and the specific behaviors that had triggered his concern. But even as she followed established procedures, her military-trained mind was processing information patterns that suggested something far more serious than routine criminal activity. Morrison's description of the suspicious vehicles included details that would have been meaningless to most civilian security personnel, but triggered immediate recognition for someone with Sarah's background. The coordination of movement between multiple vehicles, the systematic coverage of different observation points around the shopping center, and the professional-grade surveillance equipment that Morrison had observed through binoculars, all indicated a level of planning and resources that exceeded anything typical criminal organizations would employ for routine targets. The shopping center security chief's voice carried the kind of controlled urgency that Sarah recognized from military communications during developing tactical situations. Morrison was clearly dealing with something beyond his normal experience, but his law enforcement background had taught him to observe and report details that would be crucial for understanding the scope of the threat he was facing. "I count at least 8 vehicles positioned at strategic points around the perimeter," Morrison continued, his words coming faster as he realized the implications of what he was observing. "They're maintaining visual contact with each other and with the main entrances to the complex. This looks like preparation for some kind of coordinated operation." Sarah's initial response was to request additional details while beginning the standard notification process that would alert supervisory personnel and coordinate with local law enforcement agencies. But the information Morrison was providing triggered tactical analysis processes that had been developed during her military service, and she quickly recognized patterns that indicated a threat assessment far beyond anything her current role was authorized to handle. The shopping center served as an anchor for one of Phoenix's most affluent commercial districts, with over 150 stores and restaurants that attracted thousands of visitors daily. The complex included a luxury hotel, several high-end jewelry stores, and a banking center that processed significant financial transactions for the surrounding business community. Any coordinated attack on the facility would have devastating consequences for both civilian casualties and economic disruption. Morrison's continued observations painted an increasingly ominous picture of organized surveillance and preparation that seemed designed to gather intelligence about security procedures and response capabilities. The suspicious vehicles were positioned to monitor all primary access routes, while maintaining communication through equipment that appeared far more sophisticated than anything typical criminals would possess or know how to operate effectively. Sarah's military experience had included extensive training in recognizing the preliminary phases of coordinated attacks on civilian targets, and the pattern Morrison was describing matched intelligence briefings she had received about terrorist tactics employed in urban environments. The systematic surveillance, the coordination between multiple vehicle teams, and the professional equipment all suggested preparation for an operation that would require precise timing and detailed knowledge of target vulnerabilities. The dispatch center's standard protocols for handling suspicious activity reports required notification of local law enforcement agencies and coordination with client security personnel to implement enhanced protective measures. But Sarah quickly realized that the standard response procedures were designed for routine criminal threats rather than the kind of sophisticated operation that appeared to be developing at Sunrise Canyon. Webb's initial response to Sarah's report about Morrison's observations was characteristic of his approach to most unusual incidents, emphasizing the importance of following established procedures while avoiding premature escalation that might create unnecessary alarm among clients or personnel. He instructed Sarah to maintain communication with the shopping center while initiating contact with the Phoenix Police Department's non-emergency dispatch system. The police department's initial response reflected their standard approach to reports of suspicious activity from private security personnel, requesting additional details while dispatching a patrol unit to conduct a routine investigation of the reported vehicles. The responding officers would interview Morrison, observe the suspicious activity if it was still ongoing, and file a report that would be reviewed by detectives if the situation warranted further investigation. But Sarah's analysis of the developing situation indicated that standard law enforcement response procedures would be inadequate for dealing with the kind of coordinated threat that Morrison was describing. Her military training had taught her to recognize the indicators of operations that required specialized tactical response rather than routine police intervention, and everything about the shopping center incident suggested capabilities that exceeded normal criminal activity. The communication between Morrison and the dispatch center continued throughout the afternoon as the suspicious surveillance activity escalated in ways that confirmed Sarah's initial assessment about the seriousness of the threat. The vehicles began coordinating their movements with precision that indicated sophisticated planning and communication capabilities, while their occupants conducted systematic observation of security procedures and emergency response protocols. Morrison's growing concern was evident in his increasingly frequent calls to the dispatch center as he recognized that the situation was developing beyond anything his security staff was trained or equipped to handle. The shopping center's security force consisted primarily of retired law enforcement officers and military veterans who were competent at handling routine security challenges, but lacked the training and resources necessary for responding to coordinated attacks by organized groups. The first police unit to arrive at Sunrise Canyon conducted a brief patrol of the parking areas but was unable to locate the suspicious vehicles that Morrison had been monitoring. The surveillance teams had apparently recognized the approach of law enforcement personnel and had withdrawn temporarily while maintaining observation from more distant positions that allowed them to monitor police response procedures. Morrison's frustration with the police response was evident in his communication with Sarah as he explained that the suspicious activity had clearly been coordinated to avoid detection during the brief police patrol. The surveillance teams had demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical awareness and operational discipline that would be expected from professionally trained personnel rather than common criminals conducting routine reconnaissance. Sarah's request for permission to coordinate directly with Morrison about enhanced security measures was denied by Webb, who reminded her that new company policies required all client communications about unusual incidents to be handled by supervisory personnel. Her role was limited to maintaining basic communication links while senior staff managed the strategic response to developing situations. The restriction on Sarah's authority became particularly frustrating as Morrison's reports indicated that the suspicious surveillance was expanding to include other commercial properties in the surrounding area. The coordination between multiple vehicle teams suggested a threat assessment that extended far beyond the shopping center to include potential targets throughout the commercial district. Local law enforcement agencies began receiving similar reports from security personnel at other properties throughout the afternoon, creating a pattern of suspicious activity that indicated preparation for some kind of coordinated operation across multiple targets. The scope of the surveillance suggested resources and planning capabilities that exceeded anything typically associated with routine criminal activity. The Phoenix Police Department's tactical response team was notified about the developing situation as reports accumulated from multiple commercial properties, but their deployment procedures required additional authorization and coordination that would take several hours to implement. The delay between initial threat recognition and specialized response capability created a vulnerability window that could be exploited by attackers who had clearly studied standard law enforcement procedures. Sarah's analysis of the developing situation included consideration of factors that wouldn't occur to personnel without military experience in asymmetric warfare and terrorist tactics. The coordination between surveillance teams, the systematic intelligence gathering about response procedures, and the timing of the operation all suggested preparation for an attack designed to maximize casualties while minimizing the effectiveness of security and law enforcement response. The afternoon shift change at Phoenix Security Solutions brought additional personnel into the dispatch center, but the briefing process was limited by company policies that restricted information sharing about ongoing incidents to personnel with appropriate authorization levels. Sarah's detailed knowledge of the developing situation could not be fully communicated to incoming dispatchers because her analysis exceeded the scope of her current responsibilities. Morrison's final communication before the situation escalated beyond all standard response procedures came at 4:23 p.m., when he reported that the suspicious surveillance teams had been replaced by different vehicles whose occupants appeared to be conducting final reconnaissance before implementing whatever operation they had been planning throughout the afternoon. The shopping center security chief's voice carried the kind of controlled fear that Sarah recognized from military personnel who had identified threats that exceeded their ability to respond effectively. Morrison knew that something serious was about to happen, but his resources and authority were inadequate for preventing or effectively responding to the kind of coordinated attack that appeared imminent. Sarah's request for permission to coordinate enhanced security measures with Morrison was again denied by supervisory personnel who maintained that standard company policies prohibited unauthorized escalation of security responses. Her role was limited to maintaining communication while senior staff determined appropriate response procedures according to established protocols. The psychological pressure of recognizing a developing crisis while being prevented from taking effective action created exactly the kind of impossible situation that Sarah had hoped to avoid by choosing civilian employment over continued military service. Her tactical training was screaming warnings about imminent danger, but her current role prevented her from implementing the kind of proactive measures that could prevent catastrophic consequences. The gap between what Sarah knew needed to be done and what she was authorized to do was becoming a chasm that threatened not just her personal integrity, but the safety of thousands of innocent civilians who would become victims if the developing attack proceeded without effective intervention. The systematic restrictions that Blackstone had imposed on her authority were now preventing her from protecting people who depended on her company for security services. Morrison's desperate final transmission would come within minutes, reporting that the coordinated surveillance had suddenly ceased and that multiple vehicles were moving toward the shopping center from different directions in what appeared to be the beginning of whatever operation had been planned throughout the afternoon. The time for standard procedures and established protocols was ending, and the moment was approaching when Sarah would be forced to choose between maintaining her anonymity and preventing a massacre that could have been avoided if anyone had recognized what she was capable of accomplishing. The crisis that was about to unfold would test every limitation that had been imposed on her authority, while demanding exactly the kind of tactical expertise that her military service had developed. The quiet dispatcher who had endured months of systematic diminishment was about to face a situation where silence was no longer an option, and where the difference between theoretical knowledge and combat experience would be measured in human lives rather than quarterly profit reports. The internal battle raging within Sarah's mind as Morrison's reports grew increasingly urgent was unlike anything she had experienced during her transition to civilian life. Every instinct developed through years of combat operations was screaming that immediate action was required, while the constraints of her current role demanded that she follow procedures that were wholly inadequate for the crisis developing at Sunrise Canyon Shopping Center. Her hands trembled slightly as she maintained communication with Morrison, a physical response that she recognized as the first sign of the psychological stress that accompanied situations where her tactical training conflicted with artificial limitations imposed by people who couldn't comprehend the stakes involved. The tremor was barely perceptible, but it represented the beginning of a transformation that would either save lives or destroy the carefully constructed anonymity that had become her refuge from military service. The classified operations that Sarah had conducted during her Apache pilot career included extensive briefings on terrorist tactics employed against civilian targets, and the pattern Morrison was describing matched intelligence profiles she had studied during counterterrorism training exercises. The systematic surveillance, the coordination between multiple teams, and the professional equipment all indicated preparation for what military analysts classified as a, quote, complex attack, designed to maximize casualties while overwhelming standard emergency response capabilities. Sarah's knowledge of terrorist operational planning told her that the surveillance phase Morrison had been observing was likely the final preparation before an attack that had been planned for weeks or months. The timing of the operation, occurring during peak shopping hours when the complex would be crowded with families and children, suggested that the attackers were specifically targeting civilian casualties, rather than pursuing any strategic military or political objective. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Apache helicopter missions that had made Sarah legendary within special operations circles had often involved close air support for ground forces facing exactly this kind of coordinated attack by organized groups using sophisticated tactics and equipment. Her combat experience included numerous engagements where split-second decisions about target identification and engagement rules had meant the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic casualties among friendly forces and civilian populations. The psychological conditioning that had enabled Sarah to function effectively during combat operations was reasserting itself as she recognized that the situation at Sunrise Canyon was developing beyond the capabilities of conventional security and law enforcement response. Her breathing became more controlled, her situational awareness expanded to encompass multiple information streams simultaneously, and her mind began processing tactical options with the kind of analytical speed that had once made her decisions legendary among her military peers. But the most devastating aspect of Sarah's internal conflict was her recognition that the systematic restrictions Blackstone had imposed on her authority were preventing her from implementing measures that could save hundreds of lives. Her expertise in coordinating complex tactical responses was being wasted while innocent people faced a threat that standard security procedures were never designed to address effectively. The classified psychological profiles that Sarah had undergone during her military service had identified her as someone whose moral framework was built around protection of innocent life rather than abstract concepts of duty or hierarchy. The knowledge that she possessed capabilities that could prevent mass casualties while being prevented from using those capabilities created exactly the kind of psychological pressure that had contributed to her decision to leave active military service. Morrison's increasingly desperate communications painted a picture of professional security personnel who recognized that they were facing something beyond their training and resources but lacked access to the kind of tactical expertise that could provide effective guidance. The shopping center security staff included several military veterans and retired law enforcement officers, but none of them had experience with the kind of coordinated attack that appeared to be developing. Sarah's analysis of the tactical situation indicated that standard law enforcement response would arrive too late to prevent initial casualties and would likely be inadequate for dealing with attackers who had clearly studied police response procedures and planned their operation to exploit predictable limitations in emergency response capabilities. The gap between threat recognition and effective tactical response would create a window of vulnerability that could result in dozens or hundreds of casualties. The moral weight of possessing life-saving knowledge while being prevented from acting on that knowledge was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her military career, where her authority had been absolute and her decisions had been supported by command structure that understood the stakes involved in combat operations. The civilian employment that had offered refuge from military responsibilities was now creating a different kind of impossible choice between personal safety and moral obligation. Webb's continued insistence that Sarah follow standard company procedures while Morrison's reports grew increasingly urgent reflected the fundamental disconnect between civilian security management and the realities of tactical crisis response. The dispatch supervisor's approach was based on liability management and procedural compliance rather than mission accomplishment and casualty prevention, creating a situation where following orders would directly contribute to preventable deaths. The other dispatchers in the center were beginning to recognize that something unusual was developing as Sarah's communication with Morrison intensified and her demeanor shifted in ways that suggested knowledge and concern that exceeded normal professional boundaries. Maria Santos, the most experienced dispatcher, approached Sarah's workstation with questions about the situation that reflected her growing awareness that routine procedures were inadequate for whatever was happening at the shopping center. Sarah's attempts to explain the seriousness of the developing threat were constrained by her inability to reveal the military experience that informed her tactical analysis, creating a situation where her warnings sounded like speculation rather than expert assessment based on classified training and combat experience. Her colleagues could see her obvious concern but couldn't understand the source of her certainty about the inadequacy of standard response procedures. The Phoenix Police Department's communication with Morrison reflected their standard approach to reports from private security personnel, emphasizing the importance of avoiding premature escalation while gathering additional information that could be used to determine appropriate response levels. The police commanders making these decisions had experience with criminal activity and routine emergency situations, but lacked the specialized training necessary for recognizing the indicators of coordinated terrorist attacks. Sarah's knowledge of law enforcement response capabilities told her that even if police tactical units were deployed immediately, their arrival time and standard operating procedures would be inadequate for preventing the kind of attack that Morrison's observations suggested was imminent. The attackers had clearly studied police response times and deployment procedures, planning their operation to exploit predictable gaps in emergency response coverage. The corporate security protocols that governed Phoenix Security Solutions' response to unusual incidents were designed to minimize company liability rather than maximize protective effectiveness, creating a situation where following established procedures would actually reduce the chances of preventing casualties during the developing crisis. Blackstone's emphasis on procedural compliance over tactical effectiveness was about to be tested in the most devastating way possible. Sarah's apartment contained equipment and documentation that could be crucial for coordinating an effective response to the developing attack, but accessing those resources would require leaving her post during a crisis and revealing capabilities that would expose her true background. The night vision devices, communication equipment, and tactical planning materials that she had retained from her military service represented exactly the kind of specialized resources that could make the difference between successful crisis resolution and mass casualties. The psychological transformation that began as Sarah recognized the inadequacy of standard response procedures was irreversible and profound, representing the emergence of capabilities that had been suppressed but never eliminated during her transition to civilian life. The tactical mindset that had once made her legendary among special operations personnel was reasserting itself with the kind of analytical clarity that had kept her alive during hundreds of combat missions. Morrison's voice during his final routine communication carried the kind of controlled desperation that Sarah recognized from military personnel who had identified threats that exceeded their capability to respond effectively. The shopping center security chief knew that something catastrophic was about to happen, but lacked both the authority and the resources necessary for implementing protective measures that could prevent mass casualties. The moment of decision approached as Sarah realized that the restrictions imposed on her authority were creating a situation where following orders would directly contribute to preventable deaths, while taking unauthorized action would expose her true identity and end the anonymous existence that had become her refuge from military service. The choice between personal safety and moral obligation was becoming impossible to avoid. The tactical analysis that Sarah conducted while monitoring Morrison's reports indicated multiple scenarios for how the developing attack might unfold, each involving casualties that could be prevented if appropriate countermeasures were implemented immediately. Her military experience provided her with knowledge of defensive strategies and resource coordination that could significantly reduce the effectiveness of any attack, but implementing those strategies would require authority that her current role didn't provide. The communication equipment available in the dispatch center was sophisticated enough to coordinate complex tactical responses if operated by someone with appropriate training and experience, but company policies restricted access to advanced capabilities that were considered beyond the scope of civilian security operations. Sarah's knowledge of military communication protocols could have enabled coordination with law enforcement agencies that standard procedures couldn't achieve. The database systems that Phoenix Security Solutions maintained included detailed floor plans and emergency procedures for all client properties, information that could be crucial for coordinating tactical responses if accessed by someone with military training in facility security and threat assessment. But Sarah's restricted authorization prevented her from accessing the kind of detailed intelligence that could inform effective countermeasures. The personnel files maintained by the company included background information about security guards and supervisory staff that could be used to identify individuals with military or law enforcement experience capable of implementing enhanced protective measures. Sarah's knowledge of tactical personnel deployment could have enabled coordination of resources that standard procedures would never consider. The moment when Sarah would be forced to choose between maintaining her anonymity and saving lives was approaching with the inexorable certainty of military operations, where hesitation meant failure and decisive action required capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The quiet dispatcher, who had endured months of systematic diminishment, was about to face the ultimate test of her commitment to protecting innocent life, regardless of personal consequences. Morrison's desperate final transmission would shatter the last barriers between Sarah's civilian persona and her warrior identity, creating a crisis that would demand every skill she had developed during years of classified operations, while destroying forever the peaceful existence she had worked so hard to build. The breaking point was seconds away, and the choice between silence and action would be made not by policy or procedure, but by the moral framework that had made her a legendary protector of those who could not protect themselves. The moment that would define the rest of Sarah's life arrived at 4:47 p.m. with a transmission from Morrison that shattered every barrier between her civilian facade and her combat identity. His voice, now stripped of professional composure, carried the unmistakable sound of someone watching a nightmare unfold in real time. Phoenix Dispatch, we have active shooters entering the main mall entrance. Multiple gunmen, automatic weapons, coordinated assault. This is not a drill. We have civilians down. Request immediate emergency response and evacuation coordination. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each syllable triggering responses that had been dormant for months but never truly absent. Her body's reaction was instantaneous and unmistakable. Heart rate spiking to combat levels, breathing shifting to the controlled pattern that had sustained her through aerial combat, and her mind clearing with the crystalline focus that had once made her decisions legendary among special operations personnel. Webb's response to Morrison's transmission reflected the paralyzing shock that gripped civilian personnel when confronted with violence that exceeded their experience and training. The dispatch supervisor fumbled with standard emergency protocols while his voice betrayed the kind of panic that Sarah recognized as fatal hesitation during crisis situations. His attempts to follow established procedures were creating delays that would cost lives while the attack unfolded according to the attacker's carefully planned timeline. The other dispatchers in the center erupted into confused activity as they tried to process information that challenged every assumption they held about routine security operations. Their training had prepared them for shoplifting incidents and parking lot fender benders, not coordinated terrorist attacks by professionally trained assault teams, using military-grade weapons against defenseless civilians. Sarah's analysis of Morrison's initial report was automatic and comprehensive, her mind processing tactical information with the speed that had once enabled her to engage multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining formation with her wingman during close air support missions. The description of coordinated entry points, automatic weapons, and systematic targeting of civilians matched intelligence briefings she had received about terrorist tactics designed to maximize casualties while preventing effective emergency response. The psychological barrier that had separated her civilian identity from her military capabilities dissolved completely, as Sarah recognized that hundreds of innocent people were about to die unless someone with her expertise took immediate action to coordinate an effective response. The months of systematic harassment and professional diminishment became irrelevant compared to the moral imperative of protecting lives that hung in the balance of decisions that would be made in the next few minutes. Her hands moved across the dispatch console with precision that surprised her colleagues as she initiated communication protocols that exceeded standard company procedures. The muscle memory of combat operations reasserted itself as she accessed communication channels and database systems with authority that her official position didn't grant, but that her expertise made essential for coordinating the kind of tactical response that the situation demanded. Morrison's subsequent transmissions painted an increasingly horrific picture of systematic execution targeting families and children who had been shopping for school supplies and back-to-school clothing. The attackers were moving through the mall with the kind of methodical precision that indicated extensive planning and rehearsal, covering each other's movements while eliminating civilians who couldn't escape quickly enough to avoid the killing zones they had established. Sarah's voice, when she responded to Morrison's desperate pleas for guidance, carried an authority that none of her colleagues had ever heard before. The hesitant dispatcher who had endured months of condescension was gone, replaced by someone whose presence commanded immediate attention and whose instructions carried the weight of combat-tested expertise. "Morrison, this is Chen. I need immediate intel on attacker positions, weapons, and movement patterns. How many entrances have they secured? And what's the status of your emergency exits?" Her questions reflected tactical thinking that transcended civilian security training, focusing on information that would be crucial for coordinating counter-assault operations rather than passive evacuation procedures. The transformation in Sarah's demeanor was so dramatic that Webb momentarily forgot his supervisory authority, recognizing that someone with capabilities far exceeding his own had taken control of a situation that was beyond his comprehension. The dispatch supervisor's attempts to reassert command authority were ignored, as Sarah implemented communication protocols that began coordinating resources with an effectiveness that standard procedures could never achieve. Morrison's relief at finally receiving competent tactical guidance was evident in his immediate compliance with Sarah's instructions, as he provided detailed intelligence about attacker positions and civilian casualties that would be crucial for planning effective countermeasures. His reports confirmed Sarah's assessment that the attack was being conducted by professionally trained personnel, using tactics designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of civilian targets and standard law enforcement response procedures. The Phoenix Police Department's initial response to reports of active shooters reflected their standard protocols for such incidents, but Sarah's analysis indicated that conventional law enforcement tactics would be inadequate for dealing with attackers who had clearly studied police response procedures and planned their operation to exploit predictable limitations in emergency response capabilities. Sarah's unauthorized access to Phoenix Security Solutions' advanced communication systems enabled her to establish direct contact with police tactical commanders and provide intelligence about the developing situation that standard dispatch procedures would never have made available. Her ability to translate Morrison's field reports into tactical assessments that law enforcement personnel could understand immediately improved the quality of information available to commanders making critical deployment decisions. The shopping center's floor plans and emergency procedures, accessed through database systems that her official authorization didn't cover, provided Sarah with detailed knowledge of facility layout that became crucial for coordinating evacuation routes and identifying positions where law enforcement personnel could establish effective fields of fire against the attackers. Morrison's reports about civilian casualties included details that enabled Sarah to coordinate emergency medical response with precision that reflected her military experience in coordinating medical evacuation under combat conditions. Her instructions to emergency medical personnel about casualty collection points and evacuation routes demonstrated knowledge of trauma care and tactical medicine that exceeded anything expected from civilian dispatch personnel. The coordination between multiple emergency response agencies that Sarah orchestrated from her dispatch console demonstrated capabilities that surprised law enforcement commanders who had never encountered civilian security personnel with her level of tactical expertise. Her ability to maintain communication with Morrison while simultaneously coordinating with police, fire, and medical personnel reflected training in multi-platform operations that few people outside of special operations possessed. Webb's attempts to contact Blackstone about Sarah's unauthorized assumption of command authority were frustrated by the regional manager's absence from the office during the crisis, leaving the dispatch supervisor uncertain about how to respond to someone whose capabilities clearly exceeded any reasonable expectation for her official position. The company's policies provided no guidance for situations where employee expertise exceeded management authority during life-threatening emergencies. Sarah's analysis of the tactical situation indicated that the attacker's systematic approach to civilian targeting was designed to create maximum psychological impact while preventing effective law enforcement response through strategic positioning and coordinated fire support. Her recognition of these patterns enabled her to provide police commanders with recommendations about tactical approaches that could minimize casualties while maximizing the effectiveness of counter-assault operations. The communication protocols that Sarah implemented demonstrated knowledge of emergency response coordination that reflected extensive training in joint operations between military and civilian agencies. Her ability to maintain operational security while sharing tactical intelligence showed understanding of information management that exceeded standard civilian security training by orders of magnitude. Morrison's growing confidence in Sarah's tactical guidance was evident in his increasingly detailed reports about attacker positions and civilian status, information that enabled her to coordinate protective measures that standard security procedures would never have addressed. His recognition that he was receiving expert tactical support transformed his role from passive observer to active intelligence collector, providing crucial information for effective response planning. The database access that Sarah's unauthorized system entry provided included detailed information about security personnel and resources throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, enabling her to coordinate with other properties and facilities in ways that could prevent the attack from spreading to additional targets. Her knowledge of how to leverage these resources reflected strategic thinking that civilian security training never addressed. The psychological pressure of maintaining operational focus while processing information about mass casualties of innocent civilians created exactly the kind of stress that Sarah's military training had prepared her to manage, but the emotional impact of listening to Morrison's reports about children being targeted by professional killers triggered protective instincts that made her determination to prevent additional casualties absolute and unwavering. Sarah's transformation from civilian dispatcher to tactical coordinator was witnessed by colleagues who struggled to comprehend how someone they had known as a quiet, unremarkable employee could demonstrate capabilities that exceeded those of senior law enforcement personnel. The revelation of her true expertise was occurring in real time, as she proved that the systematic diminishment she had endured was based on fundamental misunderstanding of her actual qualifications and experience. The moment when Sarah's civilian identity would be completely abandoned was approaching as the tactical situation demanded decisions and actions that no dispatcher could justify without revealing military training that would expose her true background. The choice between maintaining anonymity and saving lives had already been made, but the full implications of that decision were still unfolding as she prepared to implement measures that would require capabilities that officially didn't exist in civilian security operations. Morrison's next transmission would force Sarah to cross the final line between authorized procedures and unauthorized action, demanding that she reveal expertise that would shatter her anonymity forever, while providing the only hope for preventing a massacre that standard response procedures were proving incapable of stopping. The warrior who had hidden behind a desk for months was about to emerge with capabilities that would shock everyone who had underestimated her, including the attackers who had planned their operation without considering that their victims might be defended by someone whose expertise exceeded anything they had prepared to face. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with the kind of controlled terror that Sarah had heard from ground forces under direct fire during her Apache missions. "Chen, they've got the main corridor locked down. I count at least 6 shooters moving in coordinated teams. They're executing anyone who tries to run. We need immediate tactical intervention, or we're going to lose everyone in the food court." The words triggered the final dissolution of every barrier Sarah had constructed between her civilian persona and her combat identity. Her response came not from the hesitant dispatcher who had endured months of harassment, but from the warrior who had once been the most feared Apache pilot in classified operations. "Morrison, listen carefully. I'm taking command of this operation." Her voice carried an authority that silenced every conversation in the dispatch center, as colleagues who had never heard her speak with anything approaching command presence suddenly recognized that they were witnessing a transformation that transcended their understanding of who Sarah Chen actually was. Webb's attempt to interject was cut off by a single look from Sarah that conveyed more authority than any words could express. The dispatch supervisor found himself stepping back from her workstation as she accessed communication systems and databases with a level of expertise that revealed capabilities he had never imagined she possessed. Sarah's fingers moved across multiple keyboards simultaneously as she initiated communication protocols that bypassed standard emergency response procedures and established direct tactical coordination with Phoenix Police Department SWAT commanders, FBI counterterrorism units, and Arizona National Guard rapid response teams. Her knowledge of interagency communication procedures reflected training that existed far beyond civilian security education. The transformation in her physical bearing was as dramatic as the change in her voice and manner. The slouched posture and defensive body language that had characterized her civilian employment disappeared, replaced by the kind of controlled aggression that had once made her presence in briefing rooms command immediate attention from senior military officers who outranked her significantly. "All Phoenix security units, this is Control. We have active terrorist engagement at Sunrise Canyon with civilian casualties mounting. I am implementing Crisis Alpha protocols with immediate effect." The terminology she used was unfamiliar to her civilian colleagues but immediately recognized by any military veterans monitoring emergency frequencies as classification language that indicated special operations coordination. Morrison's response to Sarah's assumption of command was immediate and grateful, as he recognized that someone with genuine tactical expertise was finally providing the kind of professional guidance that the situation demanded. "Control, confirm Crisis Alpha. What are your instructions for securing civilian evacuation routes?" Sarah's analysis of the tactical situation was instantaneous and comprehensive, her mind processing multiple information streams with the kind of analytical speed that had once enabled her to coordinate close air support for ground forces, while simultaneously engaging enemy aircraft and maintaining formation with her wingman. The mall's floor plan appeared in her mental landscape with 3-dimensional clarity as she identified attack routes, defensive positions, and evacuation corridors, with precision that reflected years of studying facility security under combat conditions. "Morrison, the attackers are using a classic pincer movement to control the central corridor while establishing overwatch positions at both ends. They're counting on law enforcement to funnel into their kill zone through the main entrances. We're going to flank them through the service corridors and hit them from angles they haven't prepared for." Her tactical assessment included elements that no civilian security training would have addressed, demonstrating knowledge of asymmetric warfare and counterterrorism operations that could only have been acquired through classified military education and combat experience. The strategy she outlined reflected understanding of three-dimensional tactical thinking that exceeded anything available in standard law enforcement training. The communication she established with SWAT commanders waiting outside the mall transformed their approach to the crisis, as Sarah provided tactical intelligence and coordination that enabled them to implement assault plans far more sophisticated than standard active shooter response protocols. Her ability to maintain real-time communication with Morrison while simultaneously coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies demonstrated capabilities that amazed seasoned tactical commanders. SWAT 1, this is Phoenix Control. Your standard entry protocols will result in massive casualties. The attackers have established interlocking fields of fire covering all primary approaches. I'm uploading facility schematics with recommended assault routes that will enable you to achieve tactical surprise while minimizing civilian exposure. The database access that Sarah's unauthorized system penetration provided included architectural plans and security specifications for the shopping center that revealed structural vulnerabilities and access routes that the attackers hadn't considered during their operational planning. Her knowledge of how to exploit these advantages reflected training and facility assessment that was available only to personnel with specialized military education. Webb's growing realization that Sarah possessed capabilities that exceeded anything he had imagined was evident in his shocked expression as he watched her coordinate complex tactical operations with an expertise that surpassed senior law enforcement personnel. The quiet dispatcher he had supervised for months was revealing herself as someone whose qualifications made his own authority seem insignificant by comparison. The other dispatchers in the center had stopped their own activities to observe Sarah's transformation as she implemented communication protocols and coordination procedures that none of them had ever seen before. Maria Santos approached Sarah's workstation with questions that reflected her growing awareness that she was witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah, how do you know how to do this? Where did you learn tactical coordination? The question hung in the air as Sarah continued her coordination activities while considering how much of her background she could reveal without compromising operational security for ongoing law enforcement operations. Morrison's field reports provided continuous updates about attacker positions and civilian casualties that enabled Sarah to maintain real-time tactical awareness while coordinating response efforts that were unprecedented in civilian security operations. His descriptions of professional military tactics and equipment confirmed her assessment that the attack was being conducted by personnel with extensive combat training. Control: the attackers are using military hand signals and movement techniques. Their weapons are fully automatic with armor-piercing ammunition. This is not random criminal activity. This is a coordinated military operation targeting civilians. Morrison's intelligence supported Sarah's analysis while providing additional confirmation that standard law enforcement response would be inadequate without specialized tactical support. Sarah's coordination with FBI counterterrorism units reflected knowledge of federal emergency response procedures that civilian security personnel wouldn't possess without classified training and security clearances that exceeded standard background investigation requirements. Her ability to communicate with federal agents using appropriate terminology and classification protocols immediately established her credibility with personnel who were trained to recognize authentic expertise. The tactical guidance she provided to SWAT teams entering the mall through service corridors reflected understanding of close-quarters combat and building clearance procedures that could only have been acquired through military special operations training. Her instructions about movement techniques, communication protocols, and target identification demonstrated knowledge that exceeded anything available through civilian security education. SWAT 2, maintain interval discipline during corridor approach. The attackers have positioned Overwatch to cover your primary route. Use the maintenance access on level 2 to achieve elevation advantage before initiating contact. Civilian casualties are concentrated in the food court. Prioritize evacuation routes before engaging hostile targets. Morrison's coordination with the SWAT teams that Sarah had guided into flanking positions demonstrated the effectiveness of her tactical planning, as law enforcement personnel achieved positions that enabled them to engage the attackers without exposing civilians to crossfire. The strategic advantages she had identified were proving decisive in preventing additional casualties while enabling effective counter-assault operations. The communication she maintained with emergency medical personnel reflected knowledge of combat trauma care and casualty evacuation procedures that enabled coordinated medical response far more effective than standard emergency protocols could achieve. Her instructions about triage procedures and evacuation priorities demonstrated understanding of battlefield medicine that civilian training never addressed. Medical 1 established casualty collection point at the North Service entrance. We have multiple penetrating trauma requiring immediate surgical intervention. Coordinate with SWAT for secured evacuation routes. Do not attempt primary entrance approach until hostile positions are neutralized. Sarah's analysis of the unfolding tactical situation indicated that the attackers' operational planning had been disrupted by the coordinated response she had orchestrated, forcing them to adapt to circumstances they hadn't anticipated during their preparation phase. The strategic advantages that law enforcement personnel had achieved through her guidance were compelling the attackers to abandon their original tactical plan. The psychological impact of Sarah's transformation on her colleagues was profound as they recognized that someone they had known as a subordinate employee was demonstrating leadership capabilities that exceeded those of their senior management. The authority she projected while coordinating life-and-death operations revealed depths of experience and competence that made previous assumptions about her qualifications appear absurd. Webb's attempts to contact Blackstone about the situation were frustrated by communication systems that Sarah had appropriated for tactical coordination, effectively isolating the dispatch center from normal management oversight while she implemented emergency procedures that exceeded any authority her official position provided. The regional manager's absence during the crisis left the dispatch supervisor without guidance for responding to someone whose capabilities clearly transcended company hierarchy. Morrison's reports about the effectiveness of the coordinated tactical response indicated that the assault teams Sarah had guided into position were successfully engaging the attackers while civilian casualties had been minimized through the evacuation procedures she had coordinated. The professional competence of her tactical planning was being proven through results that standard emergency response procedures could never have achieved. Control: SWAT has achieved fire superiority in the main corridor. Attackers are withdrawing toward the anchor stores. Civilian evacuation is proceeding through secured routes. Your tactical coordination has prevented a massacre. Morrison's assessment confirmed that Sarah's assumption of command authority had been justified by results that saved hundreds of lives. The database systems that Sarah continued to access provided real-time intelligence about security resources throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area that enabled her to coordinate protective measures for other potential targets, while maintaining focus on the ongoing tactical situation at Sunrise Canyon. Her strategic thinking reflected understanding of terrorism tactics that extended beyond individual incidents to coordinated campaigns against multiple targets. The communication protocols she had established created information sharing between agencies that had never achieved such effective coordination during previous emergency situations, demonstrating her knowledge of interagency cooperation procedures that reflected training in joint operations at the highest levels of government and military coordination. Sarah's tactical control of the situation was reaching its climax, as the coordinated response she had orchestrated compressed the attackers into positions where they could be neutralized without additional civilian casualties. The professional expertise she had revealed while coordinating the operation would soon complete the destruction of her anonymity, but the lives she had saved through capabilities that officially didn't exist justified every consequence that would follow from exposure of her true identity. The moment when her transformation from dispatcher to tactical commander would be complete was approaching, as Morrison prepared to provide the final report that would confirm the success of operations that no civilian security employee should have been capable of coordinating. The warrior who had hidden behind a desk for months had emerged to prove that underestimating someone with her background could have consequences that extended far beyond personal embarrassment to matters of life and death for hundreds of innocent people. Morrison's voice carried the unmistakable tone of victory as his final transmission confirmed what Sarah's tactical coordination had achieved. Control: all hostile targets neutralized. SWAT has secured the facility. Civilian casualties: 7 wounded, 0 fatalities. Repeat, 0 fatalities. Your tactical guidance prevented a massacre. The silence that followed Morrison's report was broken only by the soft hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of emergency vehicles outside the Phoenix Security Solutions building. Sarah's hands remained poised over the communication console, her breathing still controlled in the pattern that had sustained her through countless combat missions, as the magnitude of what had just occurred settled over the dispatch center like a physical presence. Webb stood frozen behind her workstation, his face reflecting the kind of shock that comes from witnessing someone transcend every assumption about their capabilities and limitations. The dispatch supervisor, who had spent months implementing Blackstone's campaign to diminish Sarah's authority, was staring at someone whose expertise had just coordinated one of the most successful counterterrorism operations in Phoenix law enforcement history. The transformation in the atmosphere of the dispatch center was immediate and profound. The other dispatchers, who had witnessed Sarah's metamorphosis from quiet administrative employee to tactical commander, approached her workstation with expressions that combined awe, confusion, and a growing awareness that they had been working alongside someone whose true identity exceeded anything they had imagined possible. Maria Santos was the first to break the stunned silence, her voice carrying the kind of reverence typically reserved for heroes whose achievements transcend normal human experience. "Sarah, how did you know how to do that? That wasn't dispatcher training. That was military command coordination at the highest level." Sarah's response came slowly, her mind still processing the transition from combat operations back to civilian reality, while recognizing that her anonymity had been destroyed beyond any possibility of restoration. The careful barriers she had constructed between her military past and civilian present had been shattered by the moral imperative of saving lives, leaving her exposed in ways that would require fundamental changes to every aspect of her existence. "I used to fly Apache helicopters," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of confessions that could never be retracted. "Combat missions, classified operations. I coordinated close air support for ground forces, in situations very similar to what Morrison was facing." The revelation hit her colleagues like a physical blow as they struggled to reconcile the quiet dispatcher they had known with someone whose military background included the kind of specialized training and combat experience that exceeded the qualifications of most senior law enforcement personnel. The systematic harassment and professional diminishment she had endured suddenly appeared not just cruel, but absurdly misdirected. Webb's attempts to process this information were complicated by his growing realization that every restriction Blackstone had imposed on Sarah's authority had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of her actual qualifications and experience. The regional manager's campaign to limit her responsibilities had systematically neutralized capabilities that could have prevented security breaches and enhanced emergency response throughout the company's operational area. The communication equipment that Sarah had used to coordinate the tactical response continued to carry traffic from law enforcement agencies debriefing the successful operation, their conversations filled with references to the Phoenix Control Coordinator, whose expertise had enabled them to achieve results that standard protocols could never have accomplished. The professional competence of her tactical guidance was being recognized by personnel whose own qualifications represented the highest levels of civilian law enforcement training. Sarah's unauthorized access to advanced communication systems and classified databases would normally have resulted in immediate termination and potential criminal charges, but the lives she had saved through those capabilities created a situation where standard disciplinary procedures seemed not just inappropriate, but morally indefensible. The success of her tactical coordination had demonstrated that company policies restricting her authority were actually endangering public safety. Morrison's arrival at the dispatch center 30 minutes after the successful conclusion of operations brought the first direct witness to Sarah's transformation from someone who had observed her capabilities under the most extreme circumstances possible. The shopping center security chief entered the building with expressions that combined gratitude, amazement, and professional respect for someone whose expertise had exceeded anything he had encountered during his law enforcement career. "Ms. Chen," Morrison said, his voice carrying the formal tone used when addressing senior military officers, "I've coordinated with law enforcement for 23 years, including SWAT operations and terrorist incidents. What you accomplished today exceeded the tactical capabilities of personnel with decades of specialized training. You saved hundreds of lives through coordination that I've never seen matched by civilian security personnel." The validation of Sarah's tactical expertise by someone with Morrison's credentials provided external confirmation that her colleagues were witnessing something extraordinary rather than simply misunderstanding routine emergency response procedures. The professional assessment from an experienced law enforcement officer established that Sarah's capabilities represented genuine military expertise rather than fortunate improvisation during a crisis situation. The arrival of Phoenix Police Department tactical commanders seeking to debrief the Phoenix Control Coordinator, who had provided such exceptional tactical guidance, brought additional recognition of Sarah's military background from personnel whose own training represented the highest standards of civilian law enforcement education. Their questions about her tactical analysis and coordination procedures reflected professional interest in learning from someone whose expertise exceeded their own. Captain James Rodriguez, commander of the Phoenix Police SWAT unit, approached Sarah with the kind of respectful curiosity that experienced tactical personnel showed when encountering someone whose capabilities exceeded their expectations. "Ma'am, your coordination of today's operation demonstrated knowledge of joint tactical procedures that typically requires years of specialized military training. Mind if I ask about your background?" Sarah's response to Captain Rodriguez included enough details about her military service to satisfy his professional curiosity while maintaining operational security for classified missions that couldn't be publicly discussed. "I was an Apache pilot with the 1st Attack Battalion. Multiple combat deployments, close air support, and tactical coordination were primary mission requirements." The revelation of Sarah's Apache pilot background provided context that enabled her colleagues and the law enforcement personnel to understand how someone with her appearance and apparent age could possess tactical expertise that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. Apache pilots represented the elite of military aviation, selected for capabilities that included not just flying skills but strategic thinking and coordination abilities that prepared them for the most complex combat operations. Captain Rodriguez's recognition of Sarah's military credentials was evident in his immediate shift to more formal communication protocols, as he recognized that he was speaking with someone whose combat experience exceeded his own, despite her civilian employment status. "Ma'am, Apache pilots are among the most highly trained tactical coordinators in the military. Your service record must be extraordinary to have achieved that position." The psychological impact of finally being able to acknowledge her military achievements without fear of compromising her anonymity was profound for Sarah, as she experienced for the first time in months the kind of professional recognition that had once been routine during her military career. The respect and admiration being expressed by law enforcement personnel provided validation that her expertise was genuine rather than simply her own assessment of capabilities that might have been exaggerated by memory or wishful thinking. Webb's growing understanding of the implications of Sarah's revealed background was creating a crisis of authority, as he recognized that his supervisory role over someone with her qualifications was not just inappropriate, but potentially dangerous for company operations. The systematic restrictions that had been imposed on her decision-making authority suddenly appeared to be liability issues that could expose Phoenix Security Solutions to legal consequences if future emergencies revealed that they had prevented qualified personnel from implementing life-saving measures. Here, the other dispatchers' reactions to Sarah's military background varied from amazement to embarrassment, as they realized that their casual treatment of someone with her achievements had been based on ignorance of her true qualifications. Maria Santos approached Sarah with the kind of apologetic respect that comes from recognizing that someone deserving of admiration had been treated as an ordinary colleague due to lack of information about their actual accomplishments. "Sarah, I had no idea. The way you handled that coordination, it was like watching a completely different person. How did you end up working here after flying Apache helicopters in combat?" The question reflected the confusion that many civilian employees experienced when trying to understand why highly qualified military veterans chose employment that seemed beneath their capabilities and experience. Sarah's explanation of her transition from military service to civilian employment required careful editing to avoid revealing classified information while providing enough context to help her colleagues understand her career decisions. Combat operations take a psychological toll that requires transition time. Civilian employment provided the kind of quiet environment where I could decompress from military responsibilities while remaining connected to security operations. The arrival of FBI counterterrorism agents seeking to interview the tactical coordinator, who had provided such exceptional support during the crisis, brought federal recognition of Sarah's capabilities that would have long-term implications for her career options and security requirements. Their questions about her tactical analysis and coordination procedures reflected professional interest in understanding how someone with her background had ended up in civilian security employment. Special Agent Catherine Walsh approached Sarah with the kind of professional courtesy that federal agents reserved for personnel whose capabilities commanded respect, rather than suspicion. "Ms. Chen, your tactical coordination today demonstrated exceptional expertise. The FBI would be interested in discussing consulting opportunities that could utilize your specialized knowledge for counterterrorism operations." The offer of federal consulting work represented exactly the kind of career opportunity that Sarah had been avoiding through her deliberate anonymity but the exposure of her capabilities made it impossible to continue hiding from the professional recognition that her expertise commanded. The choice between maintaining civilian employment and accepting positions that utilized her military training had been made for her by the moral imperative of saving lives during the crisis. Morrison's final assessment of the tactical situation included details that would become part of official law enforcement reports documenting one of the most successful counterterrorism operations in Arizona history. His descriptions of Sarah's coordination and tactical guidance would provide permanent records of capabilities that could never again be concealed through civilian employment that failed to utilize her expertise appropriately. The tactical coordinator who prevented today's massacre demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything I've encountered in 23 years of law enforcement. Her coordination saved hundreds of lives through expertise that represents the highest levels of military training and combat experience. Morrison's professional assessment would become part of documentation that would follow Sarah throughout any future career decisions. The transformation of Sarah's professional status from civilian dispatcher to recognized tactical expert was occurring in real time as law enforcement personnel, federal agents, and her own colleagues adjusted their perceptions to accommodate the reality of her military background and combat experience. The quiet employee who had endured months of harassment was being recognized as someone whose qualifications exceeded those of most senior security personnel. Webb's realization that he had been supervising someone whose expertise made his own authority seem insignificant was creating a crisis of confidence that would require fundamental changes in how Phoenix Security Solutions managed personnel with military backgrounds. The company's policies for recognizing and utilizing veteran expertise would need complete revision to prevent future situations where valuable capabilities were systematically suppressed. The psychological relief that Sarah experienced as her true identity was finally acknowledged publicly was complicated by awareness that her peaceful civilian existence had ended permanently. The anonymity that had protected her from the expectations and pressures of her military achievements was gone.